Okay. So last week, if you guys remember, we did history from 1948 until 67, and we started talking about how what happened in 67 and just historically affects what's been going on in Palestine and what continues to go on, and especially what's happening now with one of the Kurds video, especially where she's talking about her house and how because of what happened in 1967, now Israeli settlers and the government get to say that they don't have the right permit to stay in the house that they're in. And because of that, any other settlers are allowed to come in and kick them out and take over their house. So we ended there. So today we're gonna pick up from 1967 and talk about what's been going on since 1967 and now. So I'm gonna delve a lot into the present day, what's been going on. So we could do a check-in again in case anyone wants to check in about anything. I have a couple discussion questions to start us off. Then we're gonna go into from 1967, so after 67 until current events. And then there is a like a reflection assignment that we ask you guys to do for the last week of class. So the last week of class is not going to be us or me lecturing or talking. It's going to be you guys answering a couple of questions. It's nothing intense. I can make some time for us to do them during class so you don't feel like you have to spend extra time doing it after. And we just basically want to hear what you learned from this class and what you can take with you from this class to do in the future. So to get us started, I want us to watch this video. And as you're watching it, I want you to think of what forms of resistance, and by resistance, I mean how people fight back against oppression or people that are oppressing them, occupying them, or colonizing them. So what forms of resistance are justified or allowed, and when and where should they be allowed? So this is a personal question for you guys. Everyone has a different way that they answer this in terms of how they think people should resist and what kind of ways you should fight back against your occupiers. So keep this question in mind while we watch this video. Angela Davis is an amazing activist and scholar. She currently, I don't know exactly what she's doing now, but I think she's still a professor at UC Santa Cruz. She's written a lot of books about Black Palestinian solidarity. She was part of the Black Panther Party when they were active in Oakland in the past. So she's a great activist and a great scholar and a huge supporter of Palestine, and so it draws a lot of parallels between the Black struggle and the Palestinian struggle. So I always like this video. The interviewer asks her about violence. I want you to listen to her answer and then let me know what you think.
And in my case, when I think about the fact that Ronald Reagan was the governor of California.
Why is it so low?
California, Richard Nixon was the president of the US. The whole apparatus of the state was set up against me. They had all of their resources, and the FBI, the police, and they really meant to send me to the death chamber in order to make a point. It really didn't matter who I was, or it was that I was a very convenient figure to make a point that they would suppress any efforts at revolution and liberation.
Mycket få har träffat henne. Hon sitter i denna byggnad, en domstolslokal strax utanför San Francisco, i källarvåningen i ett liten cell där. Detta är första gången en tv-kamera bärs in till henne. Själv verkar hon tyst och blek när hon kommer in.
A year ago, the Black Panthers were much more active. You heard much more about that type of struggle. Is the time of the Black Panthers past?
The Black Panthers still exist, and the Black Panthers are still extremely active in the Oakland community and in communities all over the country. I'm not sure whether you are aware of what is now happening in the Black Panther Party and the kinds of things that members of that party are doing now.
Tell me.
First of all, if you're going to talk about a revolutionary situation, you have to have people who are physically able to wage revolution, who are physically able to organize and physically able to do all that is done.
Yeah, but the question is more, how do you get there? You get there by confrontation, violence?
Oh, is that the question you were asking?
Yeah.
See, that's another thing. When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence, without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them. On the other hand, because of the way this society is organized, because of the violence that exists on the surface everywhere, you have to expect that there are going to be such explosions. You have to expect things like that as reactions. If you are a Black person and live in the Black community all your life and walk out on the street every day seeing white policemen surrounding you, when I was living in Los Angeles, for instance, long before the situation in LA ever occurred, I was constantly stopped. No, the police didn't know who I was, but I was a Black woman. I had a natural, and they, I suppose, thought that I might be a quote militant. And when you live under a situation like that constantly, and then you ask me, whether I approve of violence. I mean, that just doesn't make any sense at all.
Okay, so I'm going to pause it there. I want to just, as a disclaimer, I'm not saying that violence is always necessarily the answer. And I don't think that our role in this country is, when we're talking about Palestine, is ever necessarily violence. But I think what she talks about from her experience back then in this country, and someone asking her, well, like, why are you okay with violence? I want us to think of that in the present day in the context of Palestine. How do you guys think this relates to conversations that people have about Palestine or about Palestinians specifically and how they resist today? So do you see any similarities, or do you think it's different from what Angela Davis is saying about the way that the way they asked her that question, and then the way that people ask Palestinians that question? And if my question doesn't make sense, let me know. I can rephrase. So thanks, Sada. I'll rephrase it. I guess I'll just ask them as yes or no questions. Do you think that similar conversations or questioning of why violence is used happens to Palestinians? So do we think that people question the way that Palestinians resist and how they should resist?
Unfortunately, yes. I think it's constantly questioned what the Palestinians do and why are they doing it. Like, someone throws a rock, it's like, okay, so they're clearly the ones starting the issue. And it's like, well, if you look, okay, why are they throwing the rock?
Yes, thanks, Soto. Exactly. And that's kind of what I was trying to get us to start off thinking with is, I'm sorry, I'm not feeling that well, so bear with me. What I'm trying to get us to start thinking about is who is always questioned when they need to defend themselves, and who is allowed to always use violence to defend themselves. So to answer that question in terms of what's happening in Palestine, exactly what Sada said, Palestinians don't really have a lot of weapons. I mean, more so when we'll watch in a little bit, they've been getting, but especially in the past, it's been mostly rocks, having to, make something of what they have to be able to defend themselves and fight for themselves. And that's always talked about in such a negative way. And Palestinians are always called terrorists, especially in American Western news. But when Israel uses violence against Palestinians, and they're using violence in military tanks and really intense weapons that unfortunately the United States helps them get, they're never questioned. They're always talked about as if they are defending themselves. So that difference is really important. And so our role is not necessarily fighting with Palestine right now. but our role could be to help people question, well, who is allowed to defend themselves and who isn't? Or why is it that we always call Palestinians the bad ones and say that Palestinians are causing problems, and we never see the other side of, you know, the Israeli violence and what they are kind of responding to. So that's, I this might be like a lot right now, but once we go through the PowerPoint, I think it'll make sense, because what we're gonna focus on in terms of a lot of the present day, from 67 to the present day, is how Palestinians have resisted and how Palestinians have tried for decades to fight against Israel and to get their land back. And that's also a really important thing to know historically, because unfortunately, a lot of sentiments against Palestinians, even from other Arab countries, like I have family members, my family's from Lebanon, I have family members or community members who would say, well, you know, Palestinians should have stayed and fought harder for themselves. And that would always make me really angry. I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, first of all, they did, and it's so much easier for you to say it than for people who were in it. But unfortunately, that's the reality. A lot of people say, well, they should have never left and they should have stayed and fought. And what we're gonna go through today is gonna show how many decades of resistance in so many different ways, not always violent, Palestinians have engaged in.
And in my
So we'll start with, so these are some of the questions I want you to think about. I want to give us a couple of minutes to just reflect on them. If anyone feels like they can answer them right now, we can start answering them, but we can also come to them towards the end when we finish watching all of the videos I have, and talk about them a little bit more. But right off the bat, first question is, what does intifada mean? Have you heard the word intifada before, and when? Why and when did Palestinians resist? So by resist, we mean fight back against Israeli occupation. How do people react when Palestinians resist? And how can we here resist to support Palestinians? So how can we resist here? Resistance, again, does not always mean violence, does not always mean being on the ground. There are lots of ways that we can support. So what are things that we can do here to support Palestinians? Does anyone want to try to answer any of them off the bat? Maybe with the word intifada, you could use the raise your hand function. Have you ever heard the word intifada before? Or just give me a reaction on Zoom. Okay, so Jamal, Sara, Rand, okay. Do any of you want to share where you've heard it or what you think it means? Or if you know what it means, what it means?
Like the first time I heard the word intifada was at a protest in like Clifton, I think. So it was during like when what happened in Sheikh Jarrah. So my family and I went to a protest, and there was a man speaking in a microphone, and towards the end he was like, intifada, like long live the intifada.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what it means, but it's like something to do with resistance or something.
Yeah, in literally in Arabic it means to shake off. So it refers to a couple of uprisings that have happened in Palestine in the past, which we're going to learn about today, where Palestinians were very intensely on large levels resisting. So yeah, that's basically what it means. It's shake off. Uprising. It refers to Palestinian uprisings on the ground. There have been 2 of them so far. Some argue that there has been a third one in 2020 to 2022, which we'll learn about. But nothing officially has been called the third intifada yet. And yes, we hear it a lot at protests. It's something that we say to show our support for Palestinians who are resisting, or the ways that Palestinians have resisted is, especially at protests, you'll hear them chant like intifada, intifada, or long live intifada. That's perfect. Thanks, Jen. I think we'll come to the other questions towards the end so that you can have more context to be able to answer these. So just keep them in mind. So there have been 2 official intifadas in Palestine. Again, intifada just meaning Palestinians organize themselves on really large levels to resist across the country Israeli occupation. And there's two quick videos that just kind of explain the first and the second one, and then we can talk about them if any of you have questions. So they talk about something called the Oslo Accords here, which we're going to get to in a little bit. That's what ended the first Intifada. But just initial thoughts. What comes to mind, or what pops out from this video about Palestinians resisting, or the first Intifada?
I think maybe the part, at least that for me was the most significant, was at the end where, it showed like President Clinton, there, and I guess he was like representing America or anything like that. But I just find it interesting that there's only intervention, when there seems to be like clear when there's like, in like the 4 digits, of people dead, 1,000 Palestinians killed. Or maybe it was just, they only responded because there were 160, Israeli soldiers killed, who knows why. But I don't know, I thought that was kind of, weird that like throughout, history and, despite that first one, you don't really see too much intervention in, aid of trying to find peace or anything like that. So I don't know. I thought that was kind of really disappointing, that the only reason it happened was just so that to like basically placate Palestinian revolt and advocation of self-rights and human rights.
Yeah, 100%. I think you hit it right. What did they say? You hit the nail on the head. But that's exactly it. That's a part of what's frustrating. Is I think you were right. I think the reason that America started getting involved is because, the number of Palestinian killed had to get so high, and I also think it's because there were also Israelis being harmed or killed. And I think it's because we saw Palestinians resisting, right? So in 1948 and 1967, right, we learned about all those last week. How many Palestinians were killed, were displaced, were harmed, were injured, but no one deemed it important enough to get involved. But the minute that Palestinians are starting to fight back and that Israelis are getting affected or harmed, then it's like, oh, wait, hold on, we need peace. We need everyone to, which again, there's nothing wrong with peace. But something else, speaking of protest, another chant that you will hear a lot at protests is no justice, no peace. And so if you're ever kind of wondered, like, what does that mean? And why are people saying no peace? It's not that we don't want peace. It's that we want peace, but we also need justice with it. And justice means both people, both parties being treated fairly, having the same access to resources and to power. So it's not fair to all of a sudden come and say peace when just because you don't like the fact that Palestinians are starting to actually have enough ability and power and confidence to fight back. So that's a very great first point, Jamal. And we're gonna learn a little bit about how, unfortunately, even that so-called peace did not do much for Palestinians. Any other like reflections or things that kind of stood out or popped out from this video from about the first Intifada in general? So I think even things like the Kufiyya, for example, right? The Kufiyya becoming a symbol of Palestine and of Palestinian resistance. We see a lot of the history and origins of that from people wearing it during things like the Intifada as a way, if you could tell just from this picture, a way to cover their face, both mainly from tear gas and from whatever chemicals that might be thrown at them, or just, wind, rocks, at whatever it is, to protect their face. And then also, I think, as a way of, masking themselves too for their own safety. So even something like the Kufiyya has, which a lot of times we just wear it as a scarf, but a lot of people wear it as protest, and it's definitely a way to show Palestinian support and solidarity. We see a lot of that symbolism start from here. Anything else from this video? So the last thing I'll point out, which I always thought was, really great sign of Palestinian unity, is if you noticed in the video, they talk about how like schools and universities were shut down. And that, to me, that symbolizes how all of Palestinian society came together. It wasn't just like, we're just going to have a group of people who are resisting and we're not part of it. The Intifadas always signify full Palestinian involvement in many different ways. And especially as we learn about the second one, and more recently, some of the resistance from youth on the ground, I think that unity is really inspiring and really important amongst Palestinians. And so with the Intifadas, it was a long time. So it's lasted a couple of years, and it was all of Palestinian society kind of working together or being on the same page of like, we're gonna keep resisting until we get freedom. So that was the first Intifada. Once we get to the second Intifada, I want you to try to pinpoint some differences from the first and the second Intifada.
And Abir, if it's okay, I just wanted to comment on one more thing. It was kind of like something you had just said, like about, how they like close schools and everything like that. And when they were saying that, I kind of thought, it's kind of crazy because here, like for snow day or whatever, we would be so happy, like, oh my God, that's great, we get a free day off. But it's really shocking to them think over there how they get a day off or something like that, and then it's almost like, they're thinking like it's almost obligatory for them to, okay, well now this means that I have to go fight and kind of defend my home, family, community, that sort of stuff. So and I'm sure like obviously there's a sense of nobility in that, and I'm sure some pride, but I mean that's gotta, you're like what, like 9, 10, young teenager, and that's your worry when here we just have to think about, oh well, day off, that's great, we don't have to do homework or go to classes. but there means something tremendously different for them. And I think that kind of goes back to what you were saying before about how like they're incredibly different wars that we're fighting here and that they're fighting there. They're fighting a war of like physical violence and oppression and stuff, and here it's more of an intellectual war. It's one of, you know, kind of trying to demonstrate like reason and logic and say like, you know, this isn't right what's going on there. So you know, we have different tools, I guess, in our toolbox, and they have their own. But yeah, I just found that kind of interesting.
Yeah. No, thanks for sharing that, because that's a really important point. I think it's a good reminder of some of the privileges that we have, like talking about Palestine here or being Palestinian here. And yeah, even something like school is closed for a lot of us here. It's like that's the best thing ever. And then first people in Palestine, and there's a lot about how, you know, school children are able to access schools because of checkpoints on a daily basis and things like that. But you know, for schools to be closed because of this resistance, and again, it's not a bad thing, but that does cause some trauma, and that is difficult, and that speaks to how not all children are allowed to have childhoods, you know, and some children have to grow up in the world a lot faster than other children, and so that's a really good reminder for us, not to make us feel guilty, but just to remind us of like, well, what can I do to support? Because, you know, at the very minimum, I can educate someone or talk about it. So that's a great point. Thanks, Shamad. And these are kind of the things I want you all to be thinking of and engaging with as we're watching these videos, is really like what stands out. Doesn't have to be any right or wrong answer, just what stands out to you, and how can we reflect on our role here and our responsibility here for Palestine. Okay, so the first Intifada was ended with the signing of these peace agreements that was mentioned in the last video, which are also called the Oslo Accords. So again, first Intifada was from 87 to 93. So that's 5, 6 years, I think it was like 92, 93. So about 5, 6 years. And that was a long time. Like, that doesn't seem like that long for us maybe, but that's a long time in terms of like resisting and fighting and curfews and all the stuff that that we saw in the video. So I also want to give a disclaimer. I know that this is just one of the best videos I could find about the Oslo Accords. I know that it says how the Oslo Accords failed. Oslo Accords are very controversial in the Palestinian community amongst people who are very into politics. So I do not mean to like impose this side that Oslo Accords have failed. A lot of people, you know, really appreciate and admire the Oslo Accords. You can kind of be in the middle. I'm gonna explain to you both reasons why people love them or hate them. But after we watch it, because I also want to hear from you what you think about them and why you think people might think they're great and why you think people might think that they weren't the best thing to do. But we'll watch this video to start us off.
This handshake was the hope of peace between Palestine and Israel. And this is what the map was supposed to look like, but this is the reality. The Oslo Accords that defined the end of the occupation in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank were signed in 1993. It was the moment that the Palestinian Liberation Organization recognized the State of Israel, and Israel recognized the PLO. The Accords aimed to set up the Palestinian Authority as an interim government. That interim government was supposed to transform into a permanent one after the Palestinian Independence State was established in Gaza in the West Bank by 1999. The two sides were given 5 years to come up with a final agreement that would lead to a two-state solution. But now, years after the due date, Palestinians still don't have a state. To understand why, we first need to dig deeper into the agreement, then understand what has happened since on both sides. The Oslo Accords were signed after several secret meetings were mediated by Norway for over a year. Popularly called Oslo I, they established the Palestinian Legislative Council, which would be democratically elected and meant self-governance for Palestine. They also set parameters for the gradual withdrawal of Israeli forces from parts of Gaza and the West Bank, which has been under illegal occupation since 1967. Before the entire West Bank was scheduled to go under Palestinian control, the region was divided into these three areas: A, B, and C. Area A, according to the agreement, was meant to be under full Palestinian control. It initially comprised 3% of the region and grew to 18% by 1999. Area B is where Palestine would have civil control and Israel and Palestine would have joint security control. It consisted of around 25% of the region. In 2011, it went down to 21%. Area C would be under full Israeli control except for its Palestinian civilians and form up to 74% of the territory. But this was never implemented. Israel did withdraw from a tiny part of the area, but occupied the West Bank after Operation Defensive Shield in 2002. It still continues to build illegal settlements that are against the Geneva Convention while destroying Palestinian villages. The effort put into the Oslo Accords was recognized by the international community. In 1994, Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat, Israeli Foreign Prime Minister Shimon Peres, and Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. In May 1994, the first phase of the Oslo Accords was implemented. Israel and the PA signed the Cairo Agreement, giving Palestinians control over parts of Gaza and Jericho. Then in 1995, a second agreement was finalized in the city of Taba, Egypt. That would give the PA additional territories in the densely populated West Bank. But the Oslo Accords have not even come close to being realized in any meaningful way. First, they were opposed by many Palestinians and Israelis. An ultranationalist Israeli who allegedly opposed the Accords assassinated Yitzhak Rabin. Palestinians criticized the PLO for agreeing to give Israel access to over 71% of the aquifer's water in the West Bank, while Palestinians were granted only 17%. Some also claimed that the agreement curtailed Palestinian economic capacity because it kept Israel in control of the land, water, and borders. Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party won the election in 1996, but from the very beginning, they had been bitterly opposed to the deal with the PLO. Netanyahu has repeatedly denounced the accord as a violation of the historic right of the Jewish people to the land of Israel and as a mortal danger to their security. In 2000, Israel and the PA tried to negotiate a permanent agreement at Camp David in the US. The attempt essentially failed. And in the same year, the Palestinian uprising against Israel, known as the Second Intifada, began after Ariel Sharon, along with about 1,000 Israeli forces, entered Al-Aqsa compound, a sacred site to Muslims in Jerusalem's Old City. After everything that happened in the region, in 2015, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas accused Israel of not committing to the Oslo Accords and declared that Palestinians, quote, cannot continue to be bound by these agreements. And still today, a deal which would end the conflict and fulfill what the two sides committed to in the Oslo Accords, a two-state solution and a lasting peace, is still elusive.
Okay. So what do you all think about the Oslo Accords from watching this video? So you can see the first Intifada, Oslo Accords, and second Intifada are very closely tied, and we'll watch just a little bit more about the second Intifada in a minute. But what do you all think?
I think that it's kind of hysterical when they're talking about a two-state solution, when there's a series of oppression and apartheid, and then they can go ahead and say this is Israel and this is Palestine, and they're two separate entities.
Yeah. So you don't, yeah, thanks, Amir. So what Amir said, so there's also conversations in Palestinian advocacy and activism about a one state versus a two-state solution. So a two-state solution means kind of what we saw was supposed to be the peace process here, where Palestinians have control over the West Bank and Gaza, and then as an independent state called Palestine, and then Israel still remains in that middle part that they took in 1948. Which what we learned last week from 1967 is we know that the reason Palestinians need the West Bank and Gaza to be fully theirs is because in 1967, Israel started expanding through checkpoints and other ways of occupation into the West Bank and into Gaza. So the solution to end all of the violence from the first Intifada was, let's just sign a peace agreement. We'll give Palestinians the West Bank and Gaza full autonomy, no Israeli anything in it, and then Israel gets to exist. That's the two-state solution that Amira is talking about, and thank you, Amir, for sharing what you think of it. I think I personally have a lot of thoughts that are very similar, but I want to hear from everyone else too. So that would be the two-state solution. The one-state solution, in case you ever hear it, is that, you know, all of it needs to be Palestine. All of it goes back to Palestine. All of it was always Palestine. We're not just thinking about the West Bank and Gaza, because those happened from 1967. We're gonna go all the way back to 1948. Ghazi, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, of course, I agree the two-state solution. It's not what we want. It's not what should happen. But I just think it's a start. I think it's the direction we should be headed in, so that we can get that one-state solution. I just think it's the first step we need to take.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for sharing that too. And I think that's part of why I agree with you. I think there's like long-term visions, and then there's short-term solutions to get to the long-term vision. I think what happened with, and again, this is going to be very personal politics, and you don't have to agree, and a lot of people don't. There are some people that do straight up call the Oslo Accords like a sellout, and that, you know, Palestinians should have never even thought that this peace could happen. But again, I think it's a lot easier for us to sit here and say what they should have done in the midst of all of this violence in the past. I think they did what they needed to do, exactly with the intention of, we need to just protect our people from now. Let's do what we can, you know, we can get for some peace and prosperity, and then we'll figure out a long-term goal. The problem is, we're not dealing with someone who honors peace agreements and, you know, cares about peace and honors these agreements. Instead, we're dealing with Israel, who's very vicious and who gets away with a lot of violations of international law and just does not have morality to care about this. And I think that speaks to how immoral they are, and how Palestinians have always tried to engage with peace and have always tried to figure out a way to move forward. But unfortunately, we're dealing with someone really awful. Musa, I saw you had your hand up. Did you want to say anything?
Yeah, I just wanted to just say how I feel like it's kind of unfair that they really wanted to go and get like a solution where they could both live in one place, but like, you know, not have to fly or do any protests. I think it's kind of unfair that they would do that when the Palestinians have been just getting oppressed, and then they try to think about peace all of a sudden just because a lot of other things are happening. They start to think of peace only maybe because of some of their numbers have died. Now they think of peace and they still break that agreement. I just think it's kind of weird that they're like just suddenly starting to think about peace and then break it immediately.
Yeah, that's a great point. Also, Musa, I know your sister Liali has a lot of thoughts on the Oslo Accords. I think you should ask her, because she'll tell you a lot too. But I agree. I think that's the frustration, is like, even with Palestinians having to, you know, sacrifice something and agree with something that's still hard to agree with, but Palestinians still did it for the hope of peace. Israel doesn't even honor that, does not care. And I think, you know, when you're dealing with someone who's a colonizer like Israel, there's no speaking to their morality, unfortunately, is what at least we can learn from the Oslo Accords. And so I think, for me, as personally, and as if I can, I think the way that I think in a helpful way that we can think of the Oslo Accords is to try to look at it as a tool, something we can learn lessons from, and learn from whatever good things happen or bad things happen from it, and use that as a tool for how we think of liberation today. So instead of just sitting here and criticizing it, which I don't agree with it, but I'm not going to sit and necessarily completely criticize everyone who had a role in it. Instead, I'm going to try to draw lessons from it so that we can learn how to move forward. You can agree with that or not agree with that, but I think because it is a very controversial conversation in Palestinian politics, I think what we really need now is ways to move forward united and not continuing to be divided about things like this. That was a great discussion. Any other comments or thoughts about the Oslo Accords? Maybe go to your parents or your siblings and ask them about it. I'm sure they'll be impressed too, to engage in a conversation with you. I'm sorry, guys. I'm like slowly losing my voice, so I'm gonna do as much.
This handshake
as I can. So this takes us into the second Intifada. which, because Oslo was supposed to have a certain outcome, and as we see from the video, it was not honored, and Israelis did not keep with the promise it was supposed to be. And then on top of it, like we're gonna see, Ariel Sharon, who was the prime minister of Israel at the time, I think prime minister, he went to Masjid al-Aqsa, which Masjid al-Aqsa is a very sacred place for Palestinian Muslims, and went in a way that was really disrespectful to Palestinians. And it was kind of like a, like a slap in the face, like, this is mine and I can come here whenever. Especially when a lot of Palestinians also couldn't can't access to this day. Not all Palestinians are allowed in the area, depending if you have the right permit and documentation. So that sparked a second wave of resistance, because they're like, we stopped and we said that we want to have peace, and then all of a sudden that doesn't get honored, so they're going to resist again. So this is, I'm not sure if this might only be music also, and it's very quick, but it kind of explains the differences between the first and the second Intifada. Okay, I'm gonna play.
The second Palestinian Intifada or uprising started late September in 2000, triggered by then Israeli opposition leader Ariel Sharon's visit to Al-Aqsa. Sharon was accompanied by thousands of soldiers when he declared the Al-Aqsa compound would remain under Israeli control. To Palestinians, this was a provocation, and what ensued was weeks of fighting between Palestinians and the Israeli military. Overall, the Second Intifada was more than 4 years of intense violence, killing at least 3,000 Palestinians and 1,000 Israelis. The conflict prompted Israel to build a separation wall in the West Bank, dubbed by Palestinians as the Apartheid Wall.
Okay, so that was very quick, but it was again another years of violence. This was, like I said, more violent than the first Intifada. I think at this point, Palestinians are not, can plan and have had time to also plan and to coordinate and resist in different ways. I think the most important part to get out of this is towards the end, and we're going to talk about separation wall next class, but the separation wall that now exists in the West Bank is also called the apartheid wall. Israelis call it the separation wall to make it sound nicer, but Palestinians call it the apartheid wall. They built a wall in a part of the West Bank that they use the Second Intifada as the excuse that Palestinians have become so violent that they need more ways to protect themselves and to separate themselves. So they started building this wall. But what's funny, and again, there's a video that explains it much better, but what's funny about it is that the wall is built on Palestinian territory, not on the actual border, like of the Israeli-Palestinian side. So it's kind of ironic, like you're saying you're using this for safety, then why wouldn't it be kind of directly around your border? Really, the way we understand it is it's just another excuse to try to get even more of the Palestinian territory in the West Bank. So just keep that in mind, that the separation wall or the apartheid wall, it's a really big, you've probably seen it, like the wall that has a lot of the Palestinian artwork and graffiti and really great artwork to showcase resistance. So Palestinians have done that to try to reclaim it and take ownership back. And we'll learn a little bit more in detail, but that's a very important result of the Second Intifada that still exists today. And so that separation wall is still up today. Any questions or thoughts about the Second Intifada? I know it was a quick video, but anything that stood out from it? And thinking of this question of how do Palestinians resist and how do people react when Palestinians resist? How do you guys think people reacted to the Second Intifada? So if Palestinians are using more violence, if we put quotes in that word, do we think it was covered well by other media outlets or news outlets?
I think that it probably was, but not because that the death toll on the Palestinian side was higher, but again, mostly just because, you know, the death toll on the Israeli side was significantly higher.
Yeah, so we're going into like the 2000s here. America's a lot more involved or thinking about this part of the world and foreign policy in Palestine. And yeah, I can only imagine the rhetoric of, you know, Israelis need to defend themselves and we need to put up the separation wall. And a lot of the self-defense and victimization narratives that we see today are all linked to all of these. Okay, so Second Intifada ends and lots of Palestinians are like, there's a lot to do. We need to continue resisting. Maybe on the ground, violent resistance is not the best way, not the answer right now. What else can we do? So a campaign called BDS, which some of you might have heard of, Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions, gets formed in 2005 as an international nonviolent form of resistance. So it's international in that it's not just Palestinians that engage in it. Everyone in the world can engage in this, can support it and be a part of it to support Palestinians. And it's a non-violent way of resistance. So it's also complicating, like resistance doesn't only have to be violent. And we can't afford that right now because we need to survive. But we can also engage in ways of liberation in non-violent ways. And that's what BDS offers. This is a pretty, I think it's a little bit longer video, but it does a really great job explaining everything. Also, I'm gonna actually stop my screen for a second so I can reshare it with better sound.
BDS is back in the headlines. That's Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions, the Palestinian-led movement that targets Israel for human rights violations and for its illegal occupation of Palestinian territories. Congresswoman-elect Ilhan Omar has come out in favor of BDS in principle, the first member of Congress to ever do so, though she's also acknowledged it might not work in practice. But some folks, they didn't react so well. The Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, put out a tweet calling her position alarming and claiming that BDS questions Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. Rashida Tlaib, who was also elected to Congress in November, the first Palestinian-American woman ever to be elected, also came out in support of BDS in an interview with The Intercept, upsetting even more supporters of Israel in the process. And it isn't only pro-Israel groups like the ADL or Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that get mad about BDS. Plenty of leaders across the West have tried to suggest BDS is anti-Semitic and illegitimate. From Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer,
there's only one word for it: anti-Semitism. Let us call out the BDS movement for what it is.
To British Prime Minister Theresa May,
that there can never be any excuses for boycotts, divestment or sanctions. They are unacceptable, and this government will have no truck with those who subscribe to them.
To Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau,
Jewish students still feel unwelcomed and uncomfortable on some of our college and university campuses because of BDS-related intimidation.
You too, Justin, you too. So it's time to really do some BDS myth-busting. First off, the goals of BDS are pretty clear. They're not hidden or secretive. I mean, they're on the damn website. 3 very specific goals: ending Israel's occupation, getting full equality for Palestinian citizens of Israel, and making sure Palestinian refugees have the right to return to their homes in line with international law. They don't say a word about Jews or even about the Jewish state. They're all about human rights. Maybe the rights of humans you don't like, but human rights nevertheless. And some supporters of BDS, yes, support a democratic, binational, one-state solution to the conflict. But others, like Ilhan Omar, support a 2-state solution. Then there's the whole issue of double standards. That's the main criticism of BDS, that it holds the state of Israel to a standard to which it doesn't hold other countries, which proves it's anti-Semitic.
You can't only talk about Jews, and you can't only talk about the nation state of the Jewish people. You have to have a single standard.
Well, hold on. All boycott movements are guilty of double standards. You can't boycott the whole world. Take South Africa. Loads of Americans, including American Jews, boycotted apartheid South Africa in the 1980s, even though the Mobutu dictatorship in Zaire and the Mengistu dictatorship in Ethiopia at that time were equally bad human rights violators, if not worse. Was that a double standard against poor old apartheid South Africa? Supporters of Israel lose their minds, of course, if you dare suggest Israel is guilty of apartheid, even though everyone from UN investigators to former Israeli ministers to former US presidents say it is.
Based on the evidence, the authors concluded that Israel has imposed an apartheid regime on the Palestinian people wherever they reside.
By the way, the African National Congress, the ANC, the Congress of South African Trade Unions, and Archbishop Desmond Tutu, all of the folks who were on the front line of the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, today they all support BDS. I wonder why. BDS critics always say there's a double standard. What about all the other countries who are guilty of human rights violations? Syria, Iran, Russia, North Korea, what about them? Now, not only is this pure whataboutism, it's deflection and evasion of the worst sort, but just look at the facts. Syria, Iran, Russia, North Korea are all, rightly or wrongly, subject to sanctions of some shape or form. So maybe supporters of Israel should be careful what they wish for. And by the way, on the subject of double standards, how about the double standards on the part of BDS critics? Take Andrew Cuomo, Democratic governor of New York and hardcore opponent of BDS.
Today I'm going to sign an executive order that says very clearly we are against the BDS movement, and it's very simple. If you boycott against Israel, New York will boycott you.
And yet when Mike Pence's Indiana passed a horrific law in 2015 discriminating against LGBT communities, this same Governor Cuomo ordered a boycott of that state, including a ban on New York public officials from traveling to Indiana. Got that? Boycotts against Indiana, totally fine and not anti-Christian, but boycotts against Israel, totally not fine and anti-Jewish. Huh? Incidentally, Cuomo's boycott of Indiana isn't something new or unheard of. Remember the boycotts around the Boston Tea Party in the 1770s, or Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott of the 1950s. You could argue that BDS is as American as apple pie. You could also argue that Ilhan Omar is just following in the footsteps of Rosa Parks when it comes to boycotts. And yet she's been accused of anti-Semitism. Hold on, if supporting a boycott of Israel makes you anti-Jewish, does that mean supporting a boycott of, say, Saudi Arabia makes you Islamophobic? And if so, does that make Ilhan Omar, one of the first 2 Muslim American women ever to be elected to Congress, an Islamophobe? Because guess what? She supports a boycott of Saudi Arabia on human rights grounds too. What was that about double standards? Uh-oh, there goes that talking point. Of course, much of the criticisms of BDS are just pro-Israeli talking points. They're about undermining and silencing the occupied Palestinian people. Think about it. Palestinians try and fight for their rights. They try violence, and they get called terrorists. They try non-violence, they try boycotts, and they get called anti-Semites. They can't win. Remember, the call for BDS first came in 2005 from Palestinian civil society, from hundreds of activists and NGOs on the ground in the occupied West Bank and Gaza. As Jewish-American journalist Peter Beinart, who doesn't support BDS as a whole, though he does support boycotting Israeli settlements, as even Peter wrote recently, the reason other countries have not elicited BDS-style movements is simple. There's been no mass call for BDS from inside those countries themselves. Look, I'm not saying BDS is perfect, which movement or campaign is. Nor am I saying it's definitely going to achieve all its goals. Taking on the state of Israel and its supporters around the world isn't easy. And I also accept it hasn't yet really damaged the Israeli economy, although the recent decision by major global brand Airbnb to remove postings for homes located in illegal Israeli settlements was a big win for BDS. I'm also not denying that some anti-Semites may have infiltrated the fringes of the BDS movement. That's what anti-Semites do. They use the cause of Palestine as cover for their bigotry. But why define BDS by that tiny minority of anti-Semites? Why ignore the growing number of Jews and Jewish groups who support BDS, like the organization Jewish Voices for Peace? Or my Intercept colleague Naomi Klein?
I support BDS, and I've supported BDS since 2009.
Or the famous Israeli journalist Gideon Levy.
BDS right now is the only game in town.
Why isn't BDS defined by them? And look, I get it, Jews have been subjected to boycotts for centuries, most recently and tragically by the Nazis in Germany. but it's a complete smear to suggest that BDS should be equated with that dark and ugly history of anti-Jewish boycotts. Listen to Professor Daniel Blattman, historian of the Holocaust at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and a critic of BDS. But even he says the boycott imposed on Jews by anti-Semitism and the boycott of Israel today have nothing in common. And yet you have these constant smears put about by hard-right billionaire and Republican Party donor Sheldon Adelson, who has spent millions trying to fight BDS on US college campuses, by lawyer Alan Dershowitz, who goes round the world debating and attacking BDS, and by the Israeli government, which appointed a minister specifically to tackle BDS, a minister who has since banned Jewish American supporters of BDS from entering Israel. Now, my own view is that any movement that gets this far-right Israeli government and its most vocal supporters up in arms must be doing something right. And so either way, Ilhan Omar or no Ilhan Omar, BDS isn't going anywhere.
Okay. So I think he did a great job at just laying out all of the different talking points and controversies behind BDS. Again, BDS just calls for boycotting companies that operate in the occupied West Bank or in Israel. And there's actually apps where you can see like if the company that you're supporting is complicit in that occupation. It also means divesting, so taking out any money that universities or institutions have in these corporations that are profiting off of the Israeli occupation, and sanctions. So one government sanctioning another government means, they say that we're not gonna import, export, or, engage in any economic trading with you until you stop the human rights abuses that you are doing. So I wanna hear, and BDS is still ongoing. BDS is still something that people engage in. I wanna hear what you guys think about everything that we saw in this video. So BDS itself, or some of the critiques, the talking points that Israel uses against BDS, why they're so afraid of it, any incidents of BDS victory that you saw. So he talked about Airbnb. There's another big one, an ice cream company. I want to see if any of you know it or followed it. What do you think about this?
I was just gonna say that, like, I know that a friend of mine, he's a freshman at Cornell, and he was telling me how he that there was, a group of Palestinians, and they, spray painted BDS on one of the like brick buildings on campus or whatever, and they all got suspended for like a month or something from school. And, they went to the like dean of the school or whatever. They went to go talk to him, and they were, or maybe not, I don't remember exactly who, but and they were saying like, oh well, why are we being suspended? This isn't right. Like, we, like freedom of speech, all that sort of stuff. And they were saying we've gotten numerous phone calls from Jewish students' families, their parents, in complete they're up in arms, and pressuring us to like kind of do something about this. You guys, there was anti-Semitism included in this, and we're here to foster like a healthy community, like all this kind of just like nonsense basically. And then they were basically saying how, well, no, this isn't anti-Semitism, this is us talking about BDS, and BDS isn't anti-Semitic in its nature. It's anti-Israel, which that there's no correlation between the two. Nonetheless, they still got suspended for months. So I don't know. I felt that this was kind of a good way to like share that or introduce that. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of all over the place, and yeah, it definitely sucks.
Yeah, that's really unfortunate. And sadly, that happens to a lot of, especially on college campuses, because divestment is something a lot of Palestinian students, they try to tell their university, like, to see where they might be invested in companies that profit off of Israel, support Israel, and ask them to divest their bonds and stocks and money. So those are those conversations happen a lot on college campuses. And unfortunately, people who support Palestine usually get affected in that negative way. But what you said is really important, that we have to make sure, and we have to know how to confidently say that anti-Israel does not mean anti-Semitic, right? Because anti-Semitism is bad and is awful, and none of us on this Zoom call are okay with it, because we don't agree with anyone being oppressed for their religious or racial identity, because that's literally what's happening in Palestinians, in a racial identity. So obviously we don't support BDS, but I mean, we don't support anti-Semitism, but supporting BDS just means we are calling out Israel in a non-violent way. We're telling them, until you stop doing what you're doing, we're not going to support you. And you know, we're critiquing a state and a government. We're not critiquing an identity. So you should feel very confident. If you're ever talking about Palestine and someone wants to be like, that's anti-Semitic, say that's actually not anti-Semitic. And I don't think you really know what anti-Semitic means, because I'm critiquing a government. I'm not critiquing someone's identity. So that's a really great point, Javan. Anyone else have thoughts on this video, or like some of the reactions or talking points that he was mentioning?
Yeah, I was gonna say it kind of angers me that if it was just ignorant people who kept speaking of anti-Semitism as a way to deflect the advocacy of Palestine, then I would understand. However, it's like educated politicians who are using the excuse of anti-Semitism to deflect like the human rights violations that's occurring in Palestine. That's what kind of angers me.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think the educated people would not do that, right? I think they're not educated, and I think they're extremely brainwashed, and they're so afraid. Like, there's a lot of fear tactics that go into, like, if you support BDS, you're anti-Semitic. And it's like, well, no one wants to be called anti-Semitic because, one, it's an awful thing, and two, it could completely ruin someone's career. And so it's a very strong tactic that Israel uses to scare people from, not just scare people from talking about it, but from supporting it. And then they feel like they have to very openly, you know, say like, I'm against this, and I'm gonna, yeah. So it's a lot of ignorance, it's a lot of brainwashing, it's a lot of fear tactics. It is very frustrating. I agree. Anyone else before we move on? If you have more questions, I know there's kind of a lot in these PowerPoints, and especially in this video, these are definitely a little bit more advanced, but I do think that, you know, obviously you all are smart enough and capable enough to engage with them. But if you just have questions on the side, let me know either on WhatsApp or in next week's meeting. Okay, so now I want to take us into more present day, what's been happening on the ground in the last 3 years, so 2021, 2022, and 2023. I think I'm just going to take us through all 3 videos, and then we'll try to come back to those questions if we have time. But before I do that, I just want to ask, because, you know, we've been talking more about history, more early 2000s. Now we're getting into present day, where all of you are aware and might have been following what's going on. So I know, Rand, you mentioned that you and your family went to a protest because of what was happening in Sheikh Jarrah, and Silwan, so that's 2021. So I just want to ask, what types of Palestinian conversations of resistance have you heard, not just you, Rand, but anybody, in the last couple of years? So from 2021 till today, what have you seen or been a part of? Or just heard about on the news or social media? What has been going on in Palestine? If you know. Has anyone seen anything about Palestine last couple? I'm gonna give you guys time until I pull up this video.
If you want to eat healthy and feel your best, you gotta try Kachava.
Okay, watch this video. I think, can you all let me know from last, because I think I played this sporadically last week. Can you let me know, did we watch this last week?
Kachava is the world's healthiest.
We watched up until here, right? Was talking? Yes, whoever was here last week. I think we did, because Sada, I remember you told me it made you emotional. I just want to know if we already watched it, if we shouldn't watch it again, or if it is helpful for us to rewatch it again. Here, I'll play it from the beginning so you know what I'm talking about.
لا تعيط حبيبي، عادي عادي.
هذا ما تنساها، اوعك تنسى هذا الشيء نسويه.
East Jerusalem is important to Jews, Muslims, and Christians. It's also the site.
Did we watch this last week? I think we did. We're just gonna watch it again because not everyone was on, and I think, yeah, I think is it okay if we watch it again for those who weren't on last week too, everyone?
Site of the sacred Jewish Temple Mount, but most of the people who live in this part of the city are Palestinians. That's been slowly changing since Israel captured the area in 1967 and started moving in settlers. Jewish people now make up around 40% of the population. And in 2018, Israel was emboldened by President Trump, who moved the US Embassy into East Jerusalem from Tel Aviv. It outraged Palestinians, but was celebrated by right-wing Israelis.
It is time to officially recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel.
At the heart of the fight over East Jerusalem is the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, home mostly to Palestinian families, some who came here in 1956 after being displaced by Israel when the state was created 8 years earlier. Israel claims Jews historically owned this land. Now, there's a lawsuit to forcibly evict some Palestinian residents, making its way through the courts. Protesters have been turning up since the issue reached the Supreme Court this year.
بسنة 67 أول بيت استولت عليه الجماعات الصهيونية بعد الحرب ب5 أشهر، شهر 11 67 استولوا على أول بيت بالحي وهو بيت عائلة الشنطي.
Mona al-Kurd and her relatives are one of 28 families fighting in court to keep their homes.
صدقوني ما حد من أهل الحارة رح يطلع إلا لآخر لحظة يجوا يشحطونا شحط، بدنا نعيش بيتنا أرضنا.
Other Palestinians have already.
هم ببيتك؟ هم ببيتي. تعي شوفي. هذا البيت اللي أخذته ستي لأنها لاجئة تهجرت بال48 من حيفا. هذا البيت بابا بناه بسنة 2000 لأنه تزوج وجابنا فصار بده مساحة أكبر، بس بابا أنهى بناء البيت وعمرنا ما سكناه. أجا القاضي سكر باب البيت ورجع على المحكمة وأمر إنه البيت يضله مسكر بحجة إنه مبني بدون ترخيص.
منو يعيش بيها؟
مستوطن، شباب مش عيلة.
انتوا تعيشون هنا؟
وهم هون.
وهم يعيشون؟
بالضبط.
هنا.
بابا وماما كانوا يشتغلوا حوشوا مصاري وبنوا هذا البيت.
اوكي.
كله من تعبنا وشقانا، وبعدين أصدرت محكمة الاحتلال قرار بإنه يجوز للمستوطنين السكن في المنزل. طب ما هذا البيت بدون ترخيص، صح؟ وعليه أمرين هدم. طب هو بدون ترخيص، على أي أساس بتسكنوا مستوطن إسرائيلي فيه وبتمنعوني أنا كفلسطينية أسكن فيه؟ على أي أساس؟ أني ديمقراطية هاي؟
شو تشعرين لما تشوفي؟
قهر، انزعاج، يعني مزعج متعب. أنا ما ببكي لأني ضعيفة أبداً، صدقيني والله، بس ببكي لأنه نتعاملش مع دولة عادلة، احتلال، وهذه أرضنا. أنا انخلقت، ربيت، وعيت، كبرت هون، على أساس في يجي حدا ياخدها؟ كيف؟ بأي منطق؟ اللي عم بيصير مناهض للقوانين الدولية. تهجير القسري جريمة حرب.
So that was Mona al-Kurd sharing. So again, if you were following what happened, Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan, Mona and Muhammad al-Kurd, their twins, really became spokespeople for really seeing and knowing what's happening on the ground live through their use of social media. And Muhammad al-Kurd speaks English very well, so he started getting asked to do news interviews. You can look it up. You could, finish watching this, but there's a lot of on YouTube, just a lot of his interviews, and he's really talking about what's happening on the ground in Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan, which really was just Israeli settlers using excuses of what happened in 67 and permit issues to tell Palestinians, I don't care, these houses have. So for Mona's family, her dad built in 2000, but for a lot of families, their houses were passed down from generations and grandparents. There isn't permits necessarily per se, but it is their house. And so Israel, Israeli settlers not just the government, but settlers themselves coming in and saying, if I'm going to take this house and I'm allowed to take it. And if you remember, what also got Mona Mohammed more attention was there was that guy named Jacob from Brooklyn who went to Israel and was telling them, if I don't take your house, someone else will. And that kind of went viral. And that sparked a lot of attention and conversation of what's happening. So really what was happening in 2021, Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan, was just settlers and Israeli government with even more intense confidence and racism, physically going in and telling people, this isn't your home anymore and I can take this at any time. So more displacement, more pushing Palestinians out and Israelis settling in other parts of Palestine. So that was 2021. In 2022, towards the end of 2022, there's a group called Lion's Den was formed in Nablus, a city in Palestine called Nablus, to kind of resist against and really more intensely protest against this continued confidence and intensified, settlers. So by settlers, I mean Israeli settlers. It's not just the Israeli Defense Force, not just the military occupation anymore. It's settlers themselves, just regular people, because they're Israelis with all of this confidence and audacity, going in and harming Palestinians, and checkpoints, and just really being done with the way that life is for Palestinians, and wanting to form a group of a youth-led and grassroots organized group to resist in Palestine. So that we see that towards the end of 2022.
Thank you for joining us. Fighting has erupted in the occupied West Bank after Israeli forces launched an operation against a Palestinian armed group called the Lion's Den. The occupation forces entered the old town of Nablus on Monday night, sparking protests. At least 4 people have been killed in Nablus and 1 near Ramallah. Another 21 have been injured. There have been power cuts in parts of the city. Demonstrations have also been reported in Ramallah. Nida Ibrahim has more from Ramallah.
It's important to point out that the Lion's Den has had a lot of support by Palestinians lately. We've seen Palestinians praising them. Those groups of people have posed a challenge to Israel, not only because they are young men who say that Israel only understands the language of force, sometimes going inside Israel, or to confrontation points and carrying out shooting attacks against Israel, but also because they are cross-factional. They're from different Palestinian factions. They are mobilized in a way that was hard for Israel to penetrate. And we've seen an increase in the Israeli measures to try and track down the Lion's Den. The city of Nablus has been under siege for more than 2 weeks. So we know that the tension is high. We are approaching the Israeli elections. This is a time when many Palestinian analysts would tell you Israel would try to show that it has an iron fist, that it's trying to win more votes by appealing to the right-wing voters in Israel and by showing that they are cracking down on any military activities by the Palestinians.
So what do we know about the Palestinian group, the Lion's Den? Well, members of the armed group first appeared in public in Nablus in the occupied West Bank last month. They recited what they called a charter of resistance during a memorial service for 2 Palestinians killed by Israeli forces. Since then, the Lion's Den has claimed responsibility for a number of attacks on military checkpoints and illegal settlements in Nablus. Ibrahim Yunus is a media coordinator for the Palestinian Youth Movement. He says the Lion's Den armed group emerged from an urgent need to protect the occupied territories.
To understand the perspective of Palestinian youth in the West Bank, you have to look at a situation where there's 800,000 settlers who are illegally occupying a great percentage of the land there. You have constant daily attacks on Palestinian youth who are, whether they're crossing checkpoints, whether they're walking to school or to work. The number of young Palestinians run over by cars or attacked by settlers is large. So obviously there's going to be a lot of popularity among youth in the West Bank when a group says that they're not going to accept the presence of these settlers on their land. They emerged out of a group of youth who defend the city, essentially, from Israeli incursions. And decided to create a more formal group that would defend the city, which is where the group name and organizational structure sort of emerged. They do not have a working relationship with the Palestinian Authority. So the Palestinian Authority at the higher levels collaborates with or coordinates security with Israel, and the Lion's Den does not. So they do not have a formal relationship.
So that is a little about the Lion's Den. So like they said in the video, because of a lot of the elections that were also happening in Israel, Israel really wanted to prove itself to its own citizens and, really show that they can shut down Palestinian resistance and they can keep Israelis safe. And so we see even heightened and more violence used against them. But I think what we've been seeing more so on the ground, and actually there's one more video I want to find of Muhammad talking about what was happening in 2021, because in 2021 is what a lot of people call the Unity Intifada, which is what I said, in the beginning. No one has officially termed it the third Intifada, but people did call it the Unity Intifada because since 2021, we're seeing a lot more unity amongst all of Palestine in terms of resistance. So before, especially after, conversations about violence and the Oslo Accords and, intifadas and violence or not violence, we see a lot of different Palestinian factions, different Palestinian political groups who didn't always work together. And 2021, what we saw was more of a unified, people from Gaza, groups from Gaza were supporting people in the West Bank, more of this unified sense of we all have the same struggle, we're all going to work together for the same goal of liberation. And that hasn't been around as much. I don't think as much as we saw it in 2021 and onwards. And so hopefully that continues. And the last video I want to show about 2023, but I remembered we did already watch this in week 2 or 3 when we did the key terms, was the nine Palestinians that were murdered in the massacre in the Jenin refugee camp. So I know we already watched it, we need to watch it again, but just really highlighting that the violence from Israel has not stopped and continues every day, unfortunately, for people in Palestine. And that's why their resistance cannot stop either. And their resistance also needs to continue every day. And so opening it back up to those questions from the beginning of class of how can Palestinians resist and how should they resist? And what do you all think our role is in supporting their resistance? So maybe we can try to, just final thoughts on those. I know we're almost at time while I pull up this last video, and then we can end with that last video. But do you all have any other thoughts or extra thoughts now after watching a lot of this about Palestinian resistance and what's been going on more in the present day? Do you support some of the resistance on the ground? Do you not? I mean, these are all where you're all going to grow up and you're going to have your own kind of political followings and ideologies, and that's great, and that's what we need. We don't need everyone to necessarily agree, but just engaging with it is a great first step. Any final thoughts or questions? Was this too much? You can also tell me if it was too much, if it was confusing, if it was too graphic. Please let me know. I'm sometimes very desensitized.
I think that that's sort of like resistance is, at least in my view, I think that's good. Like I don't think that there should be, that kind of like meekness where it's kind of just like, oh, let's kind of like just step aside. No, like I think there needs to be that. And it's unfortunate, obviously, like how much of it that there needs to be, and just like the incredible like death toll and just all that sort of stuff. But I think it's, I mentioned this a little bit earlier too, but I think it's a really noble, and like very brave of them. And they're doing something. They're fighting for, like obviously we can't, really do anything for them there. So they're doing something that, you know, we might never have been brave enough to do ourselves. So I think that's really good of them. And even though, like, you know, the argument could be made, well, this is only gonna like amplify those people, you know, or that voice of people who say, oh, well, you know, they're just terrorists or whatever. I think that, you know, right now, like, you know, it's got to be this like short-term goal of just, okay, well, we can't just keep on letting this happen, right? You can't, you know, long-term, yeah, it might not be ideal, but also you can't just step aside and, you know, be idle bystanders while your land is taken away, you know, your family is being, you know, oppressed, like all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, and what to add on to what you're saying is, we can change the narrative of how Palestinian resistance is talked about. I think that's what I really want us to walk away with today is, instead of Palestinian resistance being seen as something negative or violent or, you know, bad connotations, instead it's, like you said, look at how, you know, proud Palestinians make Palestinians around the world for how much they resist and for their resilience, and the fact that despite all of this, they still are around and we're still talking about Palestine and they're still resisting, and new generations of youth are continuing in that spirit of resistance. And so we can change that narrative of Palestinian resistance teaches us how to be strong, how to be proud, how to keep going, how to be resilient, right? We can make it into something that's more seen as a more positive way of self-defense and fighting for what is yours. So I think that's a great point. And we'll end class today with just watching this video where Mohammed kind of talks a little bit more about this unity. And then when the video ends, we can all end, because I know it's going to end right at 7. Thank you all for a great conversation today again. And I'll send you guys stuff for next week.
Sheikh Jarrah. Since Israel occupied East Jerusalem in 1967, Israeli settler organizations have been trying to remove Palestinians from their homes, not just in this neighborhood, but others too. The issue's been subject to decades-long court cases. At the core are two main issues. Settlers claim Jews own the properties, citing Ottoman-era records, and Palestinians argue they were allowed to remain in Sheikh Jarrah through an agreement between Jordan and the United Nations. Lawyers for the Jewish settlers claim that because the land was occupied by Israel in 1967, previous agreements are null and void. Lawyers for the Palestinians counter-argue that previous agreements must stand and that the residents have protected status. Palestinians cannot take Israelis to court for property taken over by the State of Israel. This checkpoint at the entrance of Sheikh Jarrah is new, installed in mid-April. Israelis can pass freely, but Palestinians who don't live in the neighborhood cannot enter. Even with press credentials, we weren't allowed to pass until the police officer was satisfied we were meeting a resident. That resident is Mohammed El Kurd. He's used social media to highlight the forced expulsions of Palestinians from this neighborhood, which he describes as ethnic cleansing. But now he feels, after this latest round of violence, where Hamas cited Sheikh Jarrah as one of the reasons for the war, there is a moment for change.
I think it says a lot about national unity. This is a moment we have not seen in a very long time, particularly since the late 30s. We have not seen the Palestinian people rise up as one body from the river to the sea. And I think it says, it gives me a lot of hope.
Let me show you what it's like when a Jewish settler organization takes over a home in this neighborhood. This belongs to the El Kurd family. Now this is their home. This also used to belong to the El Kurd family up until 2009, when a court awarded it to a Jewish settler organization. And they've been living here ever since. That's the distance that we're talking about. We're not talking about huge spaces, we're talking about a home taken over, part of a home taken over from a Palestinian family. Sami Arshad is one of the lawyers for the families facing.
So I'm going to end it there because he gets into a bunch of legal stuff, but that house, obviously they're twins. So that was the thing Hasmana was talking about. And we can keep talking about present day, obviously, as we get to the end of through the rest of the course, and how we can support Palestinians even more and BDS and things like that. But thank you all again for a great conversation.